In the boardroom of Whitmore Corporation, a century-old financial empire, one question cut through the air like a blade. Who invited her? It wasn't just a question. It was a verdict. Maya Carter, the only black woman in a room full of white men in tailored suits, had been here before. The stares, the judgment, the unspoken rule that people like her didn't belong at the top. But this time, Maya wasn't here to ask for permission. She was here to end the game. In less than 30 minutes, this same room, the symbol of old money and quiet discrimination, would collapse from the inside. $5 billion would vanish. Reputations would crumble. And the people who dismissed her as an outsider would realize the truth too late. The woman they tried to humiliate was the largest shareholder in their company. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's a lesson in arrogance, prejudice, and how the world changes when the underestimated finally take control. Maya held her ground at the threshold, her smile steady, her eyes scanning the room with the cool detachment of someone who had rehearsed this moment through countless sleepless nights. The weight of their collective stare pressed down on her shoulders, calculating, dismissive, predatory, a sensation she knew too well. It was the same look she had endured at Wall Street luncheons, where introductions stalled mid-sentence. At Silicon Valley retreats, where conversations evaporated as soon as she approached. At airport lounges, where attendants questioned her right to step into first class. The Whitmores and their board were simply the latest iteration of a pattern as old as corporate America itself. They believed themselves the arbiters of belonging, the gatekeepers of legitimacy. What they could not grasp was that the woman standing before them was already far more dangerous than they imagined. She adjusted the strap of her plain leather tote, the gesture small but deliberate. The absence of ostentation was her armor. No glittering necklace, no luxury watch, no designer insignia to signal her true wealth. Only a restrained silhouette and a calm expression, masking a mind carrying the blueprint of their undoing. Finally, she broke the silence. "Good morning," she said, her voice firm but professional, with the faint trace of her Southern upbringing still lingering in its cadence. "I'm Maya Carter from Carter Capital Management." The words landed in the room like a spark in a powder keg, subtle but enough to ignite discomfort. The air shifted. Papers rustled. Robert's eyes flicked briefly from his phone, registering her presence with an expression that hovered between disbelief and disdain. Charles leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, performing the theater of control he had mastered over decades. No one offered her a seat. No one extended a hand. The only response was silence, weaponized, suffocating, intentional. And yet Maya simply stood taller, every second of their calculated rudeness sinking into her memory like a knife being cataloged. She would remember all of it. That morning had begun 3 hours earlier, in the gleaming marble lobby of Whitmore Tower, a space built less to welcome than to intimidate. The ceiling soared like a cathedral, the walls lined with imported stone, and oil portraits of founding Whitmore patriarchs gazing down with patrician disdain. It was not merely a corporate lobby, it was a monument to generational wealth, a temple to the belief that power was a birthright. Behind the marble desk sat a receptionist whose nameplate read, "Brooke Taylor," etched in elegant script. Every detail about her appearance, the immaculate blowout, the pale pink manicure that probably cost more than a week's groceries, the designer blouse tucked just so, radiated entitlement and access. When she lifted her eyes, the expression she wore was the same one people used upon discovering something unpleasant stuck to the sole of their shoe. "I'm sorry, do you have an appointment?" The words dripped with skepticism, each syllable sharpened to imply that the very thought of Maya having legitimate business in this building was absurd. "Yes," Maya replied evenly, keeping her tone professional despite the familiar knot forming in her stomach. "I'm here to see Charles Whitmore regarding the investment proposal discussion. The meeting is scheduled for 10:30. Brooke's eyebrows arched incrementally, a motion so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone less attuned to microaggressions. The gesture said everything. "Are you sure you're in the right place?" "And you are?" she asked, as if the answer were already disqualified. "Maya Carter," she said clearly, letting the title roll off her tongue with deliberate weight. "Chief Executive Officer of Carter Capital Management." For the briefest second, the mask slipped. Brooke hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then came the clicking of nails against keys. A pause far too long to be innocent. Another pause longer still. The subtle rhythm of silent judgment. "I don't see you on Mr. Whitmore's calendar this morning," Brooke finally said, her voice lilting with feigned sympathy. "Are you quite sure you're in the right building? People often get confused about locations." "I'm quite certain," Maya answered, already scrolling through her phone. She pulled up the confirmation email, the one she had received 3 days earlier. The meeting was confirmed for 10:30, executive boardroom level, regarding the $5 billion investment proposal for Whitmore Corporation's expansion initiative. The mention of the number made Brooke's expression shift, not toward respect, but toward suspicion, as though Maya had just claimed royal lineage. "5 billion," she repeated softly, as if testing the absurdity of it aloud. "I think there might be some mistake. Perhaps you're here for one of our subsidiaries. Or maybe," she paused, letting the smile tighten, "maybe you're here for the diversity initiative meeting. That's usually held in conference room B on the 15th floor. They handle those kinds of programs." The words struck with surgical precision, a dismissal disguised as helpfulness. Around the lobby, heads turned ever so slightly. Other visitors, all white, all male, all dressed in suits costing more than most people's rent, pretended not to watch, though their ears strained for every syllable. Security arrived as if on cue. Two men in dark suits moving with the casual authority of people accustomed to removing problems before they escalated. The older one had cropped gray hair and the posture of ex-law enforcement. The younger kept his hand resting near his radio, his eyes raking over Maya as though she were a shoplifter in a luxury boutique. "Ma'am, is there some kind of problem here?" the older one asked. His tone was already a verdict. She was the problem. By the time Maya had produced 3 forms of identification, displayed her corporate credentials, handed over business cards, and allowed them to make a series of unusually long phone calls to confirm her identity, a small crowd had gathered. Employees on lunch breaks, delivery couriers, visitors waiting for meetings, all of them spectators to the familiar spectacle of a black woman being interrogated in the cathedral of corporate power. The whispers began, subtle, deniable, yet loud enough for her to hear every poisoned word. "Probably someone's assistant getting ideas above her station. You know how it is with quotas these days. Have to let them in somewhere." Maya stood perfectly composed, smiling politely, answering questions she should never have been asked, producing documents she should never have had to show. But behind the mask of professionalism, she was taking notes, cataloging every slight, every assumption, every insult. Each one would soon become part of the most expensive 30 minutes in Whitmore Corporation's century-old history. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor became its own test of endurance. Brooke had insisted on escorting Maya personally, her tone sugared with false courtesy, her posture that of a chaperone guarding against intrusion. The confined space amplified every word, every glance, every vibration of Brooke's phone as it buzzed relentlessly in her hand. "So you work in investments?" Brooke asked, her pause before the word investments soaked in doubt. "That's right," Maya answered evenly. "We focus on large-scale acquisitions and strategic partnerships." "How interesting," Brooke murmured, tapping at her phone. "And how long have you been doing that?" The questions came like a drip of water against stone, gentle on the surface, corrosive beneath. Each one was designed not to learn, but to test, to probe, to seek evidence of weakness. Brooke's tone carried the subtle edge of someone convinced that Maya was out of place and simply waiting for her to admit it. Maya kept her responses clipped and precise, her patience honed from years of navigating these corridors of suspicion. But when Brooke's screen lit up again, Maya caught a glimpse of the text flashing across it. "She's actually here. Looks exactly like you'd expect. Charles is going to lose his mind." The words glowed for only a second before Brooke angled the phone away, but the damage was done. Maya had seen enough. She had endured this gauntlet before, at recruiting dinners where she was mistaken for staff, at venture capital summits where she was presumed to be someone's assistant, at charity galas where donors looked through her as though she were invisible. The ding of the elevator announced their arrival. As the doors slid open to reveal the hushed, carpeted corridor leading to the executive boardroom, Maya straightened her shoulders. The hostility of the lobby, the condescension of the escort, they were merely the opening act. The real performance was about to begin. The executive boardroom loomed at the end of the corridor, its double doors of polished mahogany gleaming under recessed lights. Brooke gestured stiffly, her hand hovering just enough to imply direction without offering genuine courtesy. Maya thanked her with a measured nod and stepped forward alone. Inside, the space radiated old money gravitas. A massive oval table dominated the room, its surface so polished it mirrored the ceiling's chandelier. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the skyline of Chicago, the city sprawling like a testament to ambition and steel. Yet despite the grandeur, the true atmosphere came not from architecture, but from the people waiting. Charles Whitmore IV sat at the head of the table, posture regal, silver hair swept back, the embodiment of entitlement so thoroughly worn it had become second nature. He did not rise. He did not extend his hand. He let the silence settle thickly, using it as a weapon honed over decades in boardrooms. Robert Whitmore lounged 2 chairs down, eyes flicking from his phone with barely disguised impatience. To his left, Linda Harrington, the CFO, tapped a pen against her notepad with sharp, precise rhythm. On the other side, Thomas Keene, general counsel, leaned back with his legal pad clutched like a shield. The remaining board members, all men, all in near-identical Navy suits, watched her with the kind of interest reserved for a gladiatorial spectacle. Maya stepped inside, crossing the Persian rug with silent composure, her leather tote steady at her side. She offered a polite smile, and when no one moved to acknowledge her, she drew in a slow breath, placing her portfolio on the table with deliberate care. The soft sound of leather against wood cut through the silence like a crack in ice. No invitation had been offered. No seat had been indicated, but Maya sat anyway. At the far end of the table opposite Charles, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. For a long 30 seconds, no one spoke. The silence was not absence but presence, a ritual meant to dominate, to unnerve, to remind her that she was a guest in their domain. Maya did not flinch. She met their eyes one by one, calm, patient, her expression composed. Inside, she filed the moment away with all the others. Another entry in the ledger she was building, one that would come due sooner than they imagined. Charles finally broke the silence, his voice smooth but laced with the authority of someone accustomed to unquestioned obedience. "Ms. Carter," he said, drawing out her name as though it tasted foreign on his tongue. "I must admit, I was expecting someone different." The words lingered in the air. Not quite a question, not quite an accusation, but unmistakably a dismissal. Robert leaned forward, seizing the chance to add his own flourish. "What my brother means," he said, with the eager sharpness of a man who enjoyed intellectual sparring, "is that Carter Capital isn't exactly a household name in our circles." Maya's face remained serene, but her eyes sharpened. She had heard this phrasing before, in countless variations, the genteel way of questioning her legitimacy without ever naming what they truly meant. Linda Harrington, the CFO, struck next. Her tone carried the crisp edge of decades spent dissecting financials. "On paper, your fund certainly exists, but the question becomes, does it have the institutional sophistication to handle a transaction of this magnitude?" Thomas Keene, the general counsel, added his weight, his voice calm but cutting. 5 years is hardly a long track record in the investment world. Most of our institutional partners have decades of proven performance, relationships that span generations, trust built over cycles of boom and bust. Charles leaned back, fingers steepled, his smile the kind that photographed warmly but felt cold in person. "And most of those funds," he said, "are led by people we've known for years, people whose families we've done business with for decades, people who understand our values, our culture, our way of doing business." The subtext was not subtle, it didn't need to be. In rooms like this, among men like these, coded language was the coin of the realm. Maya listened without interruption, each phrase sinking into her memory, each implication cataloged. When the last word faded, she opened her leather portfolio with steady hands, sliding a bound presentation across the table. Her voice was calm, professional, measured. I think you'll find, she said, that our credentials speak quite eloquently for themselves. Maya's hands moved with deliberate precision as she unfolded the presentation, the heavy bond paper sliding across the polished mahogany like a challenge laid bare. Crisp charts and graphs, flawless typography, and the weight of irrefutable numbers filled the first page. Carter Capital currently manages assets worth $2.7 billion, she began, her voice steady, unhurried, commanding the attention the room had tried to deny her. Our portfolios span technology, healthcare, renewable energy, and emerging markets. Over the past 5 years, our returns have outperformed the S&P 500 by an average of 12% annually. Her words were clear, factual, and impossible to dispute. Yet across the table, she saw the expressions harden. Numbers alone would never be enough. Manages, Linda Harrington repeated, as though the word itself left an unpleasant taste in her mouth. She leaned forward, her pen tapping once against the margin of her notepad. The real question is capital deployment. Who are your investors? Who provides the money behind these numbers? Managing assets is one thing. Having $5 billion to deploy in a single transaction is something else entirely. Our client list is confidential, Maya replied, her tone polite but edged with steel. As I'm sure you understand, given the sensitive nature of high net worth portfolio management, what I can share is our record of successful large-scale investments and our reputation for thorough due diligence and strategic partnership. Track record, Thomas Keene cut in, his legal pad pressed tight against the table. His voice carried the patient cruelty of a man who had spent his career dismantling other people's arguments. 5 years isn't long in this world, Miss Carter. Serious investors build relationships over generations. Trust measured in decades, not annual reports. Charles smiled again, thin and practiced. And those investors are people we've known personally. People who share our traditions, our values, our way of doing business. The coded message shimmered beneath their words, as obvious as it was unspoken. Maya felt the weight of it pressing against her, the same refrain she had heard in boardrooms for 20 years. She allowed herself a single breath, steadying the cold satisfaction rising beneath her calm. They were giving her everything she needed. Every word, every insinuation, every carefully polished insult was another stone for the foundation she was building beneath their feet. Maya let their words settle into the room, the veneer of civility wrapped around barbs sharp enough to cut. She tilted her head slightly, her tone measured, as though she were asking a question for clarification in a quarterly briefing. Your culture and values, she repeated, the phrase rolling slowly off her tongue, deliberate and precise. Could you elaborate on what you mean by that? The question landed with unexpected weight. For the first time, Charles hesitated. He had expected protest, perhaps indignation, even outright anger. He had not expected clinical precision, the kind of calm request that forced him to put their coded language into the open. Well, he began finally, his tone shifting into that of a man explaining simple truths to a child. We're fundamentally a family business. 5 generations of Whitmores have built this company on certain principles: integrity, tradition, excellence, personal relationships, long-term thinking. His voice warmed slightly as he listed them, the performance of a legacy rehearsed countless times. We work with partners who share those principles, who understand the importance of protecting our culture and our reputation in the community. Maya nodded once, her expression unchanged. And you're concerned, she asked, her voice smooth, that I might not share those principles? I wouldn't say concerned exactly, Robert interjected, leaning forward, his tone heavy with the condescension of someone who had never once had his qualifications questioned. We're simply being prudent. We're talking about a partnership that could last decades. It has to align. Financially, strategically, philosophically. Cultural fit matters. Around the table, heads nodded, papers were shuffled, all of them complicit in the choreography of exclusion. Some performed exaggerated attentiveness to their notes, others wore sage expressions, but none challenged the underlying message. What they could not see, what they could not even imagine, was the tiny recording device clipped neatly to Maya's lapel. Every euphemism, every coded phrase, every careful act of discrimination was being captured, preserved, and streamed in real time to a team of attorneys and strategists across the city. Their own words were laying the groundwork for what was coming, brick by brick, insult by insult. And Maya sat perfectly still, her calm expression concealing the satisfaction of someone who knew the trap was already closing. The polished mahogany doors opened with a whisper, precise as clockwork, and Evelyn Whitmore entered the boardroom as though it were a stage built solely for her performance. Every movement radiated calculation, her posture perfect from decades of cotillion training, her stride slow enough to command attention, her smile honed to disguise cruelty with charm. She was draped in Chanel, not the kind purchased off the rack, but the kind sewn to fit her body by seamstresses whose hourly rates rivaled most people's monthly income. Her presence was theater, pure and simple, the kind of spectacle old money families had perfected to remind everyone who truly belonged. Her gaze drifted lazily across the table, pausing on each board member with the intimacy of country club friendships and charity gala chatter. When her eyes settled on Maya, the mask shifted. A subtle curl of the lip, a flicker of disdain, as if something distasteful had marred an otherwise perfect arrangement. "Charles, darling," she purred, her voice sweet as honey poured over glass shards. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything terribly important." She moved to stand behind her husband's chair, her manicured hands resting on his shoulders, in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. The diamond solitaire on her finger caught the sunlight streaming in from the floor-to-ceiling windows, scattering rainbows across the polished surface of the table like a deliberate display of power. "I was just at lunch with the girls at the club," Evelyn continued, her tone light but her eyes locked on Maya. "And I told them all about this meeting. They were absolutely fascinated. Imagine, new investment opportunities." Charles's jaw tightened. "Evelyn," he said softly, a warning note threading his voice. But she ignored him. Her gaze sharpened, her voice taking on that subtle edge only generations of inherited privilege could cultivate. "Ms. Carter, is it? How very interesting. Tell me, what exactly qualifies you to be here, in our family's boardroom, discussing matters of such consequence?" The words were crafted with surgical finesse, not outright hostile, but dripping with passive aggression, engineered to wound while maintaining plausible deniability. It was the art form of wealthy women who had never been forced to confront consequences, sharpened insult cloaked as idle curiosity. Maya felt the heat rise in her chest, the old anger threatening to surface. But as she had done for 20 years, she channeled it into something colder, something sharper, something infinitely more dangerous. She leaned forward slightly, her voice even, her expression controlled. "I am qualified to be here, Mrs. Whitmore," she said calmly, "because Carter Capital Management has the financial resources, the strategic expertise, and the due diligence capabilities to execute a $5 billion investment in Whitmore Corporation. Our proposal offers terms highly beneficial to your shareholders and positions the company for substantial growth in emerging markets." Her words landed firmly, deliberately, a counterstroke to Evelyn's blade of condescension. And for the first time since entering the room, Maya allowed the faintest spark of steel to flash in her eyes. Evelyn's laugh rang out across the boardroom, sharp and crystalline, like expensive glass shattering on marble. It was the kind of sound designed to humiliate, to remind the listener that they were being mocked from a higher perch. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, her tone syrupy with false warmth, "I think there's been some confusion about how things work in our world. The Whitmore Corporation doesn't usually entertain partnerships with, well, let's just say we're very selective. We prefer firms with established legacies, families we've known for generations, people we can trust." The euphemisms piled up like freshly fallen snow, soft on the surface, heavy and suffocating beneath. Every word carried centuries of exclusion, wrapped in velvet but cutting like steel. Charles shifted uncomfortably, aware his wife's brazenness was crossing lines that might be difficult to walk back. Still, he made no move to stop her. Instead, he offered a more polished version of the same poison. "What my wife means," he said smoothly, "is that compatibility is crucial. Long-term partnerships demand cultural alignment. There may be other firms more suited to your particular perspective." Around the table, heads nodded in solemn agreement. The performance of benevolence was as practiced as it was suffocating. Their expressions carried the smugness of men convinced they were being magnanimous, even helpful, suggesting she seek minority-focused opportunities more appropriate for her. Robert leaned in, his voice dripping with condescension. Look, Mrs. Carter, I'm sure you're very capable, but this is a $5 billion transaction. Serious money, serious responsibility. We need partners who can handle the scrutiny of regulators, shareholders, the media, partners who won't turn this into some kind of social statement. Linda Harrington's interjection was swift, surgical. Yes, business is business, Ms. Carter. It isn't activism. We can't afford distractions or the wrong kind of attention. The words hung in the air like toxic fumes, invisible but unmistakably poisonous. Maya sat perfectly still, her expression composed, but inside she felt the precise click of gears locking into place. This was the confirmation she had been waiting for, the mask slipping just enough to reveal what lay beneath. She lowered her eyes briefly, as though checking the time, and let her fingers glide across her phone. The message was only 4 words, typed with the calm of inevitability. Activate Plan B now. She slipped the phone back into her bag, lifted her gaze, and gave them the faintest look of polite confusion, as though she were struggling to understand. It was a mask, carefully chosen, designed to lure them further into their own trap. I want to make sure I understand correctly, Maya said softly. Are you saying that my race is a factor in your decision-making process regarding this proposal? The boardroom froze. The question fell like a live grenade in the center of the table, and no one dared to move. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating, as if the very walls of the boardroom were holding their breath. 15 seconds passed, long enough for everyone present to recognize the danger of what had just been asked, long enough for panic to flicker in the eyes of those who knew the implications of answering. Charles's jaw tightened, the muscles working beneath his carefully composed expression. That's not what we're saying at all, Ms. Carter, he replied at last, his tone a fragile balance of irritation and restraint. That would be inappropriate and frankly illegal. What we're pointing out is that cultural compatibility is an important factor in any long-term partnership. We need to work with people who understand our values, our traditions, our approach to business. And you don't believe I understand those values? Maya asked, her voice calm, her gaze unwavering. Before Charles could respond, Evelyn leaned forward, her voice ringing with the confidence of someone who had never faced consequences. I think, dear, she said, her words cutting through the room like a blade, that you might be more comfortable working with companies more aligned with your particular community, urban development projects, diversity initiatives, that sort of thing. Everyone has their place in the ecosystem, don't you agree? The boardroom went still again, this time not with silence born of calculation, but with shock at Evelyn's brazenness. Even Charles's face betrayed a flicker of unease. Around the table, papers shuffled, eyes darted away. Some feigned focus on notes, others shifted in their chairs, all of them desperate to avoid eye contact. The hum of the climate control seemed louder, the muffled sound of traffic 42 floors below sharper. Even the air itself felt weighted with the realization that something irreversible had just been spoken. Maya closed her portfolio with unhurried grace. The soft snap of leather against polished wood cracked like a gunshot in the stillness. When she lifted her eyes again, her expression was perfectly controlled, but a new light glimmered there, colder, sharper, impossible to ignore. I want to be absolutely clear, she said, her voice steady as a surgeon's hand. You are telling me that despite Carter Capital's demonstrated financial qualifications, despite our proven record of large-scale investments, despite the competitiveness of our proposal, you are declining to move forward because of cultural fit. Because you believe I may not share your values and traditions. She made a deliberate note in her portfolio, the words visible to anyone near enough to see, 10:52 a.m. Explicit cultural fit discrimination. Multiple witnesses, recording active. Then she lifted her gaze again, her eyes moving deliberately from one board member to the next, holding each of them in place with the quiet authority of a teacher surveying a classroom of guilty children. I think I understand your position perfectly now, she continued, her tone calm, clinical. The only question that remains is whether you understand mine. Her phone buzzed once against the leather of her bag. She glanced at the screen, and for the first time since she had entered the room, a smile, cold, sharp, dangerous, curved across her lips. Maya set her phone down on the table with deliberate calm, the faint vibration still humming against the polished wood. She adjusted her posture, shoulders squared, hands resting lightly atop her closed portfolio. The shift in her expression was almost imperceptible, but it carried weight, a subtle transformation from polite guest to someone who now owned the room. I have a feeling, she said evenly, her voice slicing through the tension like a scalpel, that we're about to have a very interesting conversation about cultural fit and business compatibility. Very interesting indeed. The atmosphere in the boardroom thickened, a charge building like static before a summer storm. Charles's face reddened, his polished composure cracking as he shoved his chair back with enough force to make its wheels roll several inches across the Persian rug. When he stood, his height and the authority of his family name seemed to loom like a storm cloud. "Are you threatening us, Ms. Carter?" His voice rang with outrage, the brittle fury of a man unaccustomed to being challenged in his own domain. "Are you standing in our boardroom, in our company, and making veiled threats against the Whitmore family?" Around the table, the board members leaned in like spectators at a car crash, horrified, fascinated, unable to look away. Maya's reply was as level as a gavel striking wood. "I'm not threatening anyone, Mr. Whitmore. I'm simply observing. Actions have consequences in today's business environment. Words spoken in boardrooms don't always stay in boardrooms. Decisions made behind closed doors don't always remain private in an age of social media, regulatory scrutiny, and corporate accountability." Evelyn moved closer to her husband, her manicured hand gripping his shoulder in a gesture that was equal parts possessive and protective. Her earlier poise began to fracture, hairline cracks forming like porcelain under pressure. "How dare you speak to us this way?" she snapped, her voice rising, no longer honeyed but jagged. "Do you have any idea who we are? What this family has built over 5 generations? You walk into our building, into our private meeting, and presume to intimidate us with your attitude and your implications?" Robert shot to his feet, his chair scraping harshly against the rug. His cheeks burned with blotches of red, his fists clenched tight at his sides. "Enough! We don't have to tolerate this farce another second. Security should have stopped this at the lobby. We don't need to listen to her any longer." His hand darted toward the sleek black phone in the center of the table, fingers closing around it with the certainty of someone convinced that force would solve the problem. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Maya said quietly, her words cutting through the chaos like a blade through silk. The effect was instant. Robert froze, his hand hovering just above the receiver as if it had suddenly turned radioactive. The room itself seemed to pause. There was no panic in Maya's tone, no pleading, only cold certainty, the kind that made every man in that room reconsider what they thought they knew about the woman before them. For a long, suspended moment, Robert's hand hovered over the phone. The sharp lines of his face tightened with anger, faltered under the weight of Maya's calm. Something in her voice, not loud, not forceful, but absolute, rooted him in place. The silence broke when Linda Harrington, the CFO, spoke with the caution of someone whose instincts were screaming warnings. "Perhaps we should all take a step back," she said carefully, her voice the practiced diplomacy of decades in finance. "Clearly there's been a misunderstanding of intentions. Maybe it would be best to reschedule this meeting when everyone's had time to reconsider." "There has been no misunderstanding," Maya interrupted, her words clear, crisp, impossible to soften. Her tone carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in hostile rooms. "The communication has been crystal clear from the moment I stepped into this building. Every word, every gesture, every assumption has told me exactly who you are and exactly what you believe." Robert bristled, his pride stung by her precision. He grabbed the phone anyway, jaw set, his voice sharp as a blade. "Security, this is Robert Whitmore. We need someone in the executive boardroom immediately. There's a situation that requires removal." Evelyn was already striding toward the door, her heels striking the hardwood in a rhythm that sounded like gunfire in the tense silence. I'll call building security myself, she announced, fury spilling from her words. This has gone on long enough. People like her are all the same. They come in here with their victim stories, their threats, thinking they can shake down respectable families with extortion schemes. Maya's eyes followed her, steady, unflinching. Then she spoke, her voice calm but edged like a trap snapping shut. People like me, Mrs. Whitmore? And what exactly are people like me like? I'm genuinely curious about your assessment. The question hung in the air like bait on a hook, and Evelyn, certain in her arrogance, lunged straight for it. You know exactly what I mean, Evelyn hissed, her voice trembling with rage. Coming in here with your lawsuits, your discrimination claims, your social justice nonsense, forcing your way into places where you don't belong, thinking you can guilt your way to what you want instead of earning it the way real business families do. The words crashed into the silence with a violence that left even the other board members stunned. For the first time, Maya allowed a flicker of satisfaction to touch her face. Not anger, not injury, but quiet, razor-sharp vindication. She glanced at her buzzing phone, reading the latest urgent message, and then looked back at Evelyn with a steady gaze that made several men at the table shift uneasily in their seats. Places where I don't belong, Maya repeated softly, her tone almost reflective. Then with a faint, cutting smile, that's a very interesting phrase, because I'm beginning to think I belong here in ways you cannot even begin to imagine. Charles pushed himself to his feet, his face flushed crimson, his composure unraveling. His voice thundered through the boardroom, brittle with outrage and the faintest trace of fear. Get out! Get out of our building, off our property, before we have you arrested for trespassing and harassment. And if you even think of twisting this into some kind of discrimination stunt, you'll learn exactly what the Whitmore family's legal team can do when our reputation is at stake. Maya regarded him steadily, her expression unchanging, her voice low and precise. The Whitmore family legal team, she repeated, tasting the words as though she were evaluating a mediocre wine. Yes, I imagine they are very expensive, very skilled, very accustomed to making problems disappear for wealthy clients. But what happens when the problem doesn't want to disappear? What happens when the problem has resources of its own? The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Every face turned toward her as she reached slowly into her blazer and withdrew a device no larger than a button. She held it between her fingers, rotating it so that every eye in the room could see. Every single word you've spoken today has been recorded, she said, her tone calm, clinical, devastating. Every assumption, every coded phrase, every reference to culture and fit. Illinois is a one-party consent state. That means I am legally entitled to record any conversation to which I am a participant. This meeting has been documented, time-stamped, and streamed in real time to a team of attorneys who specialize in corporate discrimination law. The effect was instantaneous. Panic rippled through the room like a shockwave. Charles's mouth fell open, his fury choked by disbelief. Robert still clutched the phone, frozen, as though its weight had doubled in his hand. Evelyn stood rigid by the door, her bravado collapsing under the realization of what she had just said aloud. Linda's face blanched. The pen slipped from her fingers. Thomas Keene, the general counsel, went pale as snow, his legal mind racing through the implications, already calculating damages, exposure, liability. Around the table, whispers erupted into overlapping voices. Panic, denial, fury, the perfect portrait of a dynasty caught in the act of its own downfall. Through it all, Maya remained still, standing at the head of the table, the calm eye of a hurricane. She watched the unraveling with the detached focus of a strategist observing a plan unfold exactly as intended. The boardroom dissolved into chaos. Charles barked accusations of espionage and illegal surveillance, his voice cracking with the panic of a man watching his empire slip through his fingers. Evelyn demanded to know who Maya really worked for, her tone shrill, her confidence shattered. Robert shouted into the phone, insisting on an immediate security breach response. The remaining board members spoke over one another, their words colliding in a cacophony of fear and disbelief. But Maya stood perfectly calm, the center of the storm. Her phone buzzed steadily on the table, urgent messages cascading across the screen. She picked it up with deliberate ease, scanning the updates with the composure of someone reviewing a weather forecast. Gentlemen, Mrs. Whitmore. Her voice cut through the clamor like a bell, clear and commanding. I think you might want to check your phones. You're about to receive some very interesting information. Almost on cue, the sharp buzz of Charles's phone rattled against the mahogany. Then Linda's device chimed, its notification tone shrill in the tense air. Thomas's phone began to ring, with an urgency that bordered on alarm. Within seconds, the entire table was vibrating with alerts, buzzing, chiming, and ringing in a discordant chorus that echoed like sirens in the grand room. Charles snatched his phone first. His hands trembled as his eyes scanned the message. The color drained from his face, leaving his expression gray and hollow, aged by a decade in the span of seconds. "What the hell is this?" he whispered, his voice thin. "How is this even possible?" The notification blazed in red. Urgent. Carter Capital has formally withdrawn the $5 billion investment proposal. Stock price in free fall. Trading temporarily suspended. Emergency board meeting requested. Call immediately. Linda recoiled from her own screen as if it had delivered a physical blow. "Charles," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "We need to talk right now. This is catastrophic." Robert's face turned ashen, his jaw working soundlessly as he tried and failed to reach someone on the other end of the line. "This has to be a mistake," he muttered, over and over, the words like a mantra for the drowning. "Some kind of system error. This can't be real." Evelyn looked around wildly, her earlier arrogance evaporating like mist under a rising sun. "What's happening? What is all this? Someone explain to me now." Maya remained composed, her posture relaxed, her voice smooth. She scrolled through her own messages, dozens of them, with the serene satisfaction of a general watching a battle turn in her favor. "Excellent," she said quietly. "My team is right on schedule." Then she lifted her gaze back to the board. "Shall we continue?" Charles's voice cracked as he tried to summon the authority that had always commanded obedience. "Your team? What team?" His words wavered, betraying the first hints of panic. Maya opened her leather portfolio again, but this time she didn't slide out charts or financial projections. Instead, she laid out a different set of documents, each page landing on the mahogany table with the soft finality of a verdict. Corporate filings, stock ownership records, voting trust agreements. Layers of paper that, when pieced together, formed a picture none of them had anticipated. "You see," she began, her voice steady, professional, almost conversational, "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of today's meeting. This wasn't about Carter Capital begging for the privilege of investing in Whitmore Corporation." She spread another document across the table. "This was about me, as your largest individual shareholder, deciding whether to maintain my investment in this company or to liquidate and seek better opportunities elsewhere." The room froze. Every word was a scalpel, slicing away the illusion of control. Thomas Keene lunged for the papers, his lawyer's instinct overriding his shock. His eyes scanned line after line, each revelation draining the color from his face. This can't be possible," he muttered, voice hoarse. "These holdings, these shell corporations, these trusts, it's very possible," Maya interrupted, her tone polite but merciless. "And more importantly, it's completely legal. Over the past 18 months, Carter Capital has been acquiring Whitmore stock through a carefully structured network of subsidiaries and trusts. Not directly, of course. That would have triggered disclosure requirements. Instead, we use the very structures your legal team designed back in 2018 to obscure other sensitive relationships." Linda snatched the documents from Thomas's trembling hands, her financial training calculating percentages faster than her brain could process the implications. Her lips moved as she ran the numbers, her expression collapsing into disbelief. 23%, she whispered. Then louder, her voice strangled with shock. "Carter Capital controls 23.7% of Whitmore Corporation." The boardroom went silent, every eye swiveling toward Maya. "Yes," she confirmed, with the precision of someone correcting a ledger. "Which makes me the largest single shareholder in Whitmore Corporation. Which means every coded word, every dismissal, every insult you've leveled at me today. You've said to the person who owns nearly a quarter of your company." The silence was absolute. Beyond the glass windows, Chicago bustled, oblivious. Inside, the century-old Whitmore dynasty crumbled, undone by the woman they had tried so hard to exclude. Stunned silence clung to the air like smoke. No one moved, no one spoke. Only the hum of the ventilation and the distant murmur of Chicago's streets seeped through the glass. Then, as if on cue, Charles's phone buzzed again. Shrill, insistent, merciless. He answered without tearing his eyes from Maya, his voice hollow. "Yes, I'm aware of the stock price. Yes, I see the suspension notice. What do you mean the press already—" His words cut off mid-sentence, his face blanching to a ghastly pallor. "The Tribune? They have what story? How could they possibly—" "No, don't say a word. Don't make any statements until I—" He hung up, his hand trembling, his gaze fixed on Maya like a man watching his house burn. "You orchestrated this," he accused, the words hoarse. "The market moves, the media leaks, all of it. You planned this entire spectacle." Maya tilted her head, her voice calm and precise. "I didn't orchestrate your words, Mr. Whitmore. I didn't instruct your wife to talk about people knowing their place, nor did I put those assumptions in your brother's mouth. I simply created an opportunity for you to show me, and now the world, who you truly are, when you think no one of consequence is watching." As she gathered her documents with unhurried grace, the first domino fell outside those walls. At dawn the next morning, newspaper stands across Chicago carried a headline impossible to ignore. "Recorded Racism: How the Whitmore Dynasty Lost $5 billion in a Single Meeting." The story was stark, uncompromising, its front page dominated by excerpts from the boardroom recording. Each quote had been carefully chosen, each euphemism and condescending remark placed in black and white for the world to consume. Evelyn's "People Like Her" became an instant flashpoint, a soundbite repeated endlessly across morning broadcasts. By noon, hashtags like "Our Whitmore Racism" and "Boardroom Bigotry" were trending nationwide. Thousands of employees, executives, and everyday citizens shared their own stories of exclusion, amplifying the storm. Audio clips, crisp, edited, and legally vetted, flooded every platform, erasing the Whitmore family's control over the narrative. The name Whitmore, once synonymous with tradition and prestige, was now a brand poisoned overnight. In the age of instant outrage and viral accountability, the dynasty's fall had begun not with a market downturn or a failed merger, but with their own voices in the calm, deliberate witness who refused to be erased. The fallout came with a speed and ferocity that even Maya's team had anticipated only in theory. By mid-morning on the first day, Whitmore Corporation's stock was already down 37%. Analysts on CNBC spoke in stunned tones, comparing the collapse to natural disasters and black swan events. By market close, the stock had plummeted 52%, erasing nearly $2 billion in market capitalization in less than a single trading session. Financial media descended like sharks. CNBC branded it the most expensive racist rant in corporate history. Bloomberg ran a segment dissecting how a century-old institution could lose billions in hours, their anchors emphasizing one phrase again and again: shareholder value destroyed by prejudice. The Wall Street Journal detailed the mechanics of Carter Capital's withdrawal, showing how the lost investment had triggered automatic credit downgrades and violations of loan covenants. But the numbers, as devastating as they were, only told part of the story. The reputational damage spread faster than the market contagion. Evelyn's sneering line, "People Like Her," became a rallying cry on social media, clipped into 15-second videos that ricocheted across platforms. Thousands shared their own boardroom experiences, stories of exclusion and coded language, each one adding weight to the avalanche bearing down on the Whitmores. Employees inside Whitmore Tower began leaking internal emails, screenshots, whispered testimonies of similar behavior. The once impenetrable fortress of the Whitmore dynasty cracked open, every fracture exposed under the harsh spotlight of public scrutiny. Maya watched it unfold from her suite at the Four Seasons, a strategic perch just blocks from both the financial district and the major news outlets. She didn't gloat, didn't pace. She simply sat with her laptop open, eyes calm, as if she were observing a demolition she had mapped out months in advance. The first day had been about shock. The second would be about collapse. Day two began with the rupture of alliances Whitmore leadership had long considered unbreakable. At exactly 2 p.m., the Peterson Group, Whitmore Corporation's oldest and most prestigious partner, tied to the family for 3 generations, issued a terse public statement. The words were polished, professional, but devastating. After careful review of recent allegations regarding Whitmore Corporation's leadership and corporate culture, the Peterson Group has made the difficult decision to terminate all existing partnerships and contractual relationships effective immediately. The figure attached to that announcement was staggering. Over $300 million in active contracts gone in an instant. But the financial loss, while immense, was only the beginning. Peterson's withdrawal sent a signal stronger than any editorial or op-ed. Association with the Whitmore name was now toxic. By evening, the dominoes began to fall in quick succession. North Lake Industries pulled out of joint ventures. Greystone Private Wealth Management announced it was closing Whitmore accounts. Lakeshore Development Partners severed ties on multiple infrastructure projects. Heartland Infrastructure Fund and Silvercrest Advisory Group followed before midnight, each issuing statements crafted with identical phrasing about alignment with corporate values and the importance of inclusive leadership. The coordinated exodus spoke volumes. No company wanted to be the last clinging to a collapsing empire. Better to cut ties early and preserve reputation than be dragged down alongside the Whitmores. Inside Whitmore Tower, panic bled through every floor. Long-standing employees whispered in break rooms about polishing resumes. Department heads fielded frantic calls from vendors. Lawyers pulled marathon shifts drafting responses no one believed would matter. For the Whitmore dynasty, the message was unambiguous. Their name, once currency, was now a liability. The network of generational power they had relied upon for more than a century was unraveling in real time. Not because of markets or mergers, but because of words spoken in arrogance and caught on tape. And Maya, watching from her hotel suite, marked every collapse like the measured ticks of a clock counting down to the inevitable. By the morning of day three, the boardroom of Whitmore Corporation no longer felt like the bastion of confidence it once was. The same mahogany table where arrogance had reigned only days earlier now resembled the stage of a tribunal. The atmosphere was clinical, almost surgical. Not a meeting, but an execution in slow motion. Charles Whitmore IV sat rigid at the head of the table, shoulders tense, his silver hair disheveled from sleepless nights. His phone lay face down, as though hiding it could stop the torrent of headlines and market alerts pouring in. Evelyn was absent. The humiliation of her remarks had made her a liability too great even for her husband to shield. The board members, men who had once toasted Charles at the Union League Club, now avoided his eyes. Their posture was different, their deference gone. Each of them had felt the aftershocks of collapsing partnerships, the fury of shareholders, the sting of being associated with a brand that had become shorthand for corporate bigotry. It was Linda Harrington, the CFO, who finally cut through the tension. She stood, her steel gray suit immaculate, her voice cool and unflinching. In light of recent events and after consultation with our major shareholders, I am introducing a motion of no confidence in Charles Whitmore's leadership. The words struck with the finality of a gavel. Papers shifted, throats cleared, but no one raised an objection. Even Thomas Keene, the general counsel who had once defended Charles's every decision, remained silent, his eyes fixed on the table, as if the grain of the wood might offer him refuge. Charles's face hardened, his jaw clenching as though sheer force of will could hold his dynasty together. "You can't do this," he said, though his voice carried less conviction than desperation. "This company is my family's legacy. My name is on the tower, on the—" "Your name," Linda interrupted, her tone sharp as glass, "is precisely the problem. Your name now drags this corporation toward ruin. We can't afford to lose another dollar, another partner, another ounce of credibility. For the sake of Whitmore Corporation, your era ends here." The silence that followed was different this time. Not the silence of intimidation or performance, but the silence of consent. Quiet, heavy, unanimous. In that moment, Charles Whitmore realized that his family's grip on the empire had finally slipped. The dynasty had been broken not by competitors or recessions, but by the arrogance of its own making, and by the calm, unshakable resolve of the woman they had tried to dismiss. The vote was swift, clinical, and merciless. One by one, hands rose around the table. Not a single voice spoke in Charles's defense. The men who once toasted him at black tie galas now stared at the polished wood, unwilling to meet his eyes as they severed the legacy of 5 generations. The final tally was read aloud by Linda Harrington. Unanimous. Charles slumped back in his chair, the weight of it crushing him. His jaw worked soundlessly, a man struggling to breathe as the empire he believed eternal slipped through his grasp. His phone buzzed again on the table. Another urgent alert, but he didn't dare pick it up. He already knew what it would say. More downgrades, more lawsuits, more partners abandoning ship. Thomas Keene cleared his throat, his legal pad trembling in his hands. Effective immediately, Charles Whitmore IV is removed from his position as chairman and CEO of Whitmore Corporation. Interim leadership will be appointed pending shareholder approval. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed unease. Even in triumph, no one in that room felt safe. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Chicago moved on. Taxis streaking through intersections, pedestrians hurrying along sidewalks, oblivious to the implosion happening 42 stories above. Inside, however, history had turned. The dynasty was broken. And though Maya Carter wasn't in the room to witness this final moment, her presence lingered like a shadow across the mahogany table. Every man there knew it. She had entered as an outsider, dismissed as a nuisance, patronized as someone who didn't belong. But in less than 72 hours, she had transformed into the force that toppled an empire. The Whitmore name, once spoken with reverence, now carried only the bitter taste of scandal. The tower still bore the family crest, the oil paintings still glowered from their gilded frames, but the myth of untouchable power was gone. What remained was the lesson none of them could ignore. The arrogance of exclusion had a price, and this time, it was a price measured not in whispers or side glances, but in billions of dollars, collapsing legacies, and the quiet, steady victory of a black woman who refused to be erased.